how do we respond to these things that are disheartening, that are anti-worker, and that hurt the working class? And we can't.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Let's talk to Chris Doles and Colin Smalley. Chris Doles is president of IFPTE Local 98 in New York. Is it New York City or just New York State?
Well, it's New York State. We have members in New Jersey. It's the whole New York district of the Army Corps, which, as you know, defines its boundaries by watershed and not political boundaries. So we have slivers of Vermont and Massachusetts, but it's the Hudson watershed and a couple others. But yeah, generally New York State, most of New York State, we don't touch the Great Lakes, but we come close with Fort Drum with our military program. But yeah. It's a pretty sprawling area with about 400 bargaining unit employees in the New York District and the North Atlantic Division Office, which has its own interesting dynamics.
Right. Colin Smalley is president of IFPTE Local 777 out of Chicago Corps of Engineers. Colin, what are your unit's geographic boundaries?
So we've got folks in Wisconsin, Illinois, and Indiana. Ours is a watershed based as well. So we've got the Lake Michigan watershed, and we have some of the watershed in Indiana that's the Wabash River, the upper Wabash. So we have, and our union's a wall-to-wall union, so we've got, everybody who's eligible to be in a union is covered by our contract.
Chris, what about you? Is it wall-to-wall? Is it professional and non-professional?
It is. So we straddle the, FLSA and FLSA exempt folks. Ours is a little bit, there's management, when they negotiated with the union some 20 years ago around the exact boundaries of our bargaining unit, they poked some holes in it. Colin and I were just talking about this last night. Like, they define our bargaining units in the federal sector as communities of interest, and nobody ever seems to ask the question, what happens to all the scraps? What happens to all the leftovers who get plucked out of bargaining units? There's this potential at-large unit out there. I don't know, but yeah, it's basically wall-to-wall. Not as good as Colin's, because Colin just renegotiated the boundaries of his bargaining unit, which is really his expertise.
Oh, interesting. So were you able to do that like in a contract renegotiation, or how did that work?
So we were actually combining two bargaining units. So when I came in, we actually had one bargaining unit and one local for the professional workers, what the law calls professional, which is basically if the position requires a college degree. And then we had a different bargaining unit and a different local for the non-professionals, which is what the law calls it. And I hate that term, but yeah. But we combined those two bargaining units and we combined the locals. And in doing so, the FLRA has to issue a new certificate. And so when they did that, we took the opportunity, and I said to management, like, do you really want to be in the business of, one of the old things was like, you can't be a member if you're a temporary employee until after 6 months. Well, who's keeping track of that?
Right.
And it turns out management valued simplicity, and so they went along with our suggestion that our bargaining unit is all employees of the Chicago district that aren't legally excluded.
I see. Well, that's great to hear. And Lord willing, we'll be able to do that where I work at some point. But yeah, the professional and non-professional distinction is very strange, and it's actually not just that you are professional if you have to have a college degree. It's professional if you have to have a college degree that is specifically related to the profession, right? So if you're a mechanical engineer, you have to have a mechanical engineering degree. But if you're like a contract specialist, you have to have a college degree, but like it's kind of like wishy-washy. And so contract specialists, even though they got to have a degree, they're typically called non-professionals. And so it's very strange, the boundaries, and they're very muddy. And in some units, actually contract specialists are professionals, and in other units, they're not. And it's just very bizarre, and I don't like it. I think it's bad.
It's one of the primary ways that management, not just in the federal sector, but everywhere, has introduced yet another division within our workplaces. And it's a historic one dating back to the Truman era in the 1930s and 40s when labor was at its heights. People like us, like real rank and file Democratic union organizers, successfully broke down a lot of those boundaries, broke down a lot of the craft boundaries and the professional, non-professional distinction. And sure enough, those distinctions reasserted themselves in legal form, and we're still climbing back out of that hole.
Right. So, y'all are both presidents of your locals. That's a big step in and of itself, just being president of your local. And now you're trying to, you want to take the next step to be on the executive board of the International Union. Why are you wanting to take that next step? What are some of your visions for your roles on the executive board? What are you wanting to accomplish?
We're here campaigning to win the vice president seats of the federal sector. IFPTE has 2 federal seats on the executive council, and there are 3 locals here in Huntsville, Alabama, and Tennessee region. So we're trying to meet with as many people who work at the Army Corps of Engineers, NASA, and the Tennessee Valley Authority, who are represented by locals 259, 27, and 1937, the Engineering Association. So if any of your listeners are members of those locals, we're here to reach out to you and build a national community within IFPTE, but also beyond. I would say if I were to summarize our campaign platform as one thing, it's to rebuild federal sector unionism in a way that overcomes the divisions. We just talked about the professional, non-professional, but we're also divided between agencies. We're divided within agencies. We have so many different unions. There's a total alphabet soup of different unions, and there's not enough coordination. We want rank and file coordination across all of the unions and all of the agencies because we have so many shared issues. So I'd say if there's one thing that characterizes our campaign, it's an attempt to bring the exciting new energy of the labor movement we've seen in recent years, the auto workers' victories, the teachers and the nurses, this new willingness to confront management in a way that's power building and not like constantly afraid of our own shadow, like a willingness to rebuild the labor movement on the foundations that, made us as strong as we have been in the past, in the 30s and the 60s. So that's the spirit of our campaign. I'll just say that the current leadership of IFPTE generally speaks with just one voice, and there's not any debates around questions of political strategy and organizing. And organizing isn't prioritized. We're kind of a one-trick pony, and this is true of the entire federal sector. I mean, there are some exceptions I see in NTEU and AFGE, but we're basically a pretty well-oiled legislative advocacy machine. And I'm sorry, but that's not the real bread and butter. That's not where unions build their power. It's important, and we have to have relationships with politicians. I get that. But we need an organizing program that puts the membership back in the driver's seat. So big picture, I'd say that's how I would summarize what we're up to.
Yeah, and for me, a lot of it also comes down to raising expectations. We want to raise the expectations of all the members in all the bargaining units that IFPT represents in the federal sector. And that comes down to some of this stuff about, there's so much more action that we can take that we're not right now. And that, whether that's in the legislative arena, like we've been doing, or whether it's in the executive branch, it's in the judicial. I know we're going to be talking later about the shenanigans at the Supreme Court. And so, how do we respond to these things that are disheartening, that are anti-worker, and that hurt the working class? And we can't.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
Right. And so what are some of the ways that you would see being able to build power outside of that legislative advocacy? What are some of the, like, mechanically and logistically, like what do you mean when you say build power outside of the legislative advocacy?
Yeah, what do we mean by organizing? Most people think about organizing a closet, but like, what is labor organizing? Unfortunately,
I had somebody I said something about being a union organizer at one point to somebody, and they were like, or being an organizer. I think I just said organizer, and they were like, "Oh yeah, my closet is so messy."
Like we want to be the Marie Kondos of the labor movement, right? I mean, there's obviously it's the same word for a reason.
Right.
In our case, I think it's about. I'm not going to say that they don't do organizing in its kind of generic definition. They organize the existing kind of apparatus of the union towards this almost exclusively legislative advocacy agenda. And our version of organizing, that I think has a very rich tradition in the labor movement, looks to the collective action and mobilization of the membership. So just to be very concrete with what my local is in the middle of, we're in a high stakes negotiation over whether or not the Army Corps of Engineers in New York and the North Atlantic Division Office is going to consolidate the lesson of the pandemic. Are we going to recognize in contract form that telework works? And we are insisting that the mission, and management hasn't disputed it, that the mission has been met and that the retention they've managed to accomplish of the staff is largely credited to the existence of a very flexible telework arrangement where our North Atlantic Division Office folks, by contract, which we negotiated a year ago, only have to come into the office once a week, recognizing that the vast majority of what they do as program managers is on Zoom meeting or Teams meetings anyway, and they could do those Teams meetings in cubicles where they're overhearing each other an hour and a half or 2 hours from their home, or they could do it from their home and be more likely to have high morale and stick around. So we're trying to consolidate that lesson. And the way that we're flexing and forcing management to take our demands seriously, because in the federal sector, we don't have the right to strike. We have an extremely narrow scope of bargaining. We are collectively abstaining from the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey until we see management actually give it. We told management, we want to be able to favorably review you. So yeah, we're not taking the fevs, and the entire union and most of the bargaining unit employees are following our lead, and we're taking collective action, legal, protected, collective action, pretty modest at the end of the day, if you ask me. This is a voluntary survey, but this is the heights of militancy in the federal sector, is to collectively abstain, but it's getting real action because management is pissed. They don't want to see any collective action. They want to see the strike prohibition extended to all collective action. And so this is one creative way that we're doing. Management asked me, is any other union doing this kind of thing? I was like, I don't know, but I hope so. And we're certainly going to tell them about it because it's clearly getting you to pay attention finally to what our demands are. So a willingness to use collective action, and within that, a willingness to confront management. And I think this is a major strategic difference between us and the existing leadership. And the reason why I think it's important that we get these seats on the executive council is that the current MO of, and it's not just IFPTE, it's all of the federal sector, as I can tell, and it's most of organized labor, is that their whole approach to politicians is to develop as cozy a relationship as possible and hope for some favors when you need them. And that's not power building. If anything, that's a formula that over the long term you start getting taken for granted. So our approach is to build this type of collective action, that's just one example, to mobilize the membership and take a much more kind of principled, independent posture vis-a-vis the politicians. Sure, we need to have relations with them, and better or worse, wherever we can, we need good relations with the ones who treat us well, but we can't let them take us for granted. And that's why we don't have any majority at the FLRA.
Right.
Chuck Schumer's just taken us for granted for the last 3 years, and he's plenty happy as a management. He's effectively a management official in the federal sector. He's one of the most powerful management officials in the federal sector, and he's very happy with the FLRA not having a pro-union majority. And we can tell in the proof is in the pudding. He hasn't prioritized those confirmations.
Well, and I'll tell you where else we can encounter management if we're thinking about the federal government and its higher structures, the branches of government as management, is the executive branch. So as an example, in Chicago, earlier in President Biden's term, he had an executive order, and one of the things that it said that it was doing was that agencies should expand the leave they provide federal employees to vote. So this is not, so the old policy in the Department of Defense was you could get up to 4 hours, but only if your polls were only open for a certain period of time and only on election day itself. And so this executive order from the president says agencies should expand their leave.
Should.
And that's what happened, is that management. So we said, hey, we were bargaining a policy about time and attendance. And we said, we'd like to expand this out to what the EO provides. And my management said, well, we can't do that because the Department of Defense hasn't updated their leave policy. And because they haven't, the Department of the Army can't update their leave policy. And so it was this, bureaucratic quagmire where the workers on the ground didn't get the benefits that the President of the United States intended for us to. And the Department of Defense employs 2 million civilians.
Right.
So, that's 2 million people who didn't get what the president said we should get to be better members of our community, to be able to vote, and not just do early voting, but also to serve as an election judge, to actually be helping our communities run elections.
And they're political appointees who could have actually carried that down.
They could have. And this is the thing that we have, there are appointees, high-level management officials within the Department of Defense who are appointed by the president to carry out those policy objectives. And we got nothing. They could have prioritized it, and they didn't. So part of what I say when I say we need to take this fight to new places is when we go to Washington, D.C., a lot of unions have, a week where they try to get everybody into Washington, D.C. to advocate for things. We need to not just go to the Hill. We need to be meeting with these political appointees because ultimately they are part of this same problem.
And God knows Trump's political appointees carried the water for that administration much more aggressively.
They absolutely did. I did a detail at the Pentagon during the Trump administration. Not my favorite policy approach to things, but the experience was incredible. But the one thing I heard from these political appointees, whether it was in the US EPA or in the Army, they said, the president wants XYZ. If I don't do that, I'm going to lose my job. And so they knew exactly who they worked for,
right,
and their role as a political appointee. And then there's the career leadership in the government. They call it the senior executive service, and they take their cues from these political appointees. Right. And so if we can that's the barrier that's broken there. I know if for government workers that hear President Biden say that this is the most worker-friendly administration in history, a lot of us sit here and say, how so? I don't feel like I'm benefiting from that because it took the DOD 3 years to implement that executive order.
Right.
And we filed an unfair labor practice about it, and we're told that because it said should instead of shall, that we weren't going to win there. And so we even tried labor's other primary way of doing things, right? I mean, one primary way is I'm not going to say lobbying, but, political advocacy with Congress. The other way that we do things is through these formal sort of adjudicative processes. And so we went that route. We got shut down. The only way to fix the problem we had was advocating to that executive branch political appointee.
Well, and so, as we're coming up on the end of the first half of the program, folks can find us on YouTube and Facebook. We're going to continue talking for another couple of minutes with Chris and Colin during overtime about the recent Chevron decision. But as we wrap up the first half of the program, and we're going to be coming off of the radio, one of the things that people will typically ask about folks who are looking to move up in a hierarchy or seek a higher elected office is your record to this point. So your record as presidents of your own locals. So what would be some of the things that you would point to during your tenures as presidents of your locals to show that, you have been successful in those capacities as well?
I think one of the things I would point to first that Chris and I share is that we both kind of started as presidents at about the same time of our locals. And we also connected and helped revitalize an Army Corps Council within IFPTE. So this is all of the different locals that represent Army Corps workers. And so we really started building power there where we were sharing ideas. We were building pattern bargaining ideas, that kind of thing. And so that was really powerful. And we started, we were able to see by doing that we had some locals that were really struggling, that were not going to be able to obtain things like a retainer lawyer, because you can't really afford that unless you can have the membership numbers to make make it work economically. But if we all come together, we can do that kind of thing. And so same thing with going to DC and all that. So I'm really proud of the work we've done in the ACE Council. We've really built that up and turned it into a strong organization. We, meet monthly. We have quorum every time. It's well attended, well defended group. But if I had to pick one thing that I'm super proud of at my local, we won a new collective bargaining agreement last October, and there's a lot of stuff in it that I'm proud of. But one of the things that I'm really excited about is that it has a 12-year term. So everything we want in that bargaining agreement is locked in, certainly past the next presidential administration. So I consider that a huge win for the place that I'm going to be working.
Right.
In Local 98, I would have a few examples, but I'll pick one, which is I think that we have maybe not blazed a trail, but maybe reblazed a trail that has been blazed in a long time around change bargaining. There is one area in negotiations where federal sector unions have real leverage, and that's in change bargaining. There's all this talk about CBA bargaining, and Colin gave a good example of how you can win big in CBA bargaining. But change bargaining is the place that you can actually stop management from implementing a change and in the process generate real leverage. Management hates it. You got to be willing to piss off management though, and you got to be willing to mobilize the membership and find out what they need. And we've used change bargaining to great effect, and we have really strong contracts in particular around telework thanks to our use of change bargaining.
All right, folks, that is Chris Doles and Colin Smalley, presidents of IFPTE Local 98 and 777, respectively, out of New York and Chicago. We're going to be going into overtime with them here momentarily, but appreciate everybody for tuning in while we are on the radio. If you haven't gotten enough of us, then you can find us on Facebook and YouTube. We're still going to be streaming for another hour and a half.
Can we give our website?
Yeah. Where can folks find out more about your campaign?
Smalley-doles.com is our website of our campaign. If those are hard to spell, just go to lets-organize.com.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.